So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Herman. I am the Managing Director of the Arctic Institute and one of the principal investigators of the Migraiton in Harmony Research Coordination Network, which is putting on this webinar as part of a larger webinar series. Myself, along with my co-PIs, Beth Ferris, who you will be hearing from in just a bit, and our other co-PI, Dr. Chad Briggs at University of Alaska Anchorage, are running a research coordination network funded by the National Science Foundation to bring together people who are working on the many dimensions of Arctic migrations, from species and ecosystem range migrations further north to community displacement and relocation, like we will be hearing about today, to economies and diseases and security challenges moving further north that are catalyzed by geohazards, climate change, urbanization, and globalization. If that sounds up your alley, I would highly encourage you to join our network so you can see more webinars and hopefully join us in Alaska next year for our in-person workshop. Throughout this webinar, which will be about an hour and a half, I will be moderating the chat. If you have questions throughout the presentations, please list them in the chat. We will be opening it up to questions and answers at the end of our time, and I will be looking to the chat to see if any questions have come in throughout the presentations. I will also ask, if you want to ask a question, to raise your hand at the end by clicking on the participant icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and raising your hand through that participant page. Finally, we will be recording this webinar and I will be sharing that YouTube link tomorrow in an email. So if you have to leave a bit early, don't worry, you can catch the playback anytime that fits your schedule on that recording. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to the first of our three presenters today. You will be hearing from Beth, from Erica, from Sanjula about relocations as they relate to environmental displacement and migration, how they have successfully and unsuccessfully been supported across the world, what they have learned from their own case study research and years of experience working in, alongside, and collaborating with international organizations, and how this can relate to Arctic displacement, migration, and relocation. I will leave it up to each of them to introduce themselves, a little bit about their background, and why they came into this work, to contextualize it a bit for all of us here. So I'm going to hand it over first to my co-PI, Beth, to take us away.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Victoria, and thanks to all of you for tuning in today. Kudos to Victoria for getting this amazing network up and running. These webinars I've participated in have all been eye-opening. I think it's really fun to learn from other disciplines. I'm a political scientist who's worked on the field of refugees and migration for decades. I'm based in Geneva in the US, now a research professor at Georgetown University. And we would like to tell you a little bit about how the issue of planned relocations came on the international agenda, some of the efforts to develop guidance and suggestions for how governments, civil society, academics, others can relate to the issue of planned relocations, and then turn to my two colleagues, Sanjula Weerasinghe, who's based in Geneva, has worked with several international organizations, and like me, started out working with refugees and migrants. And then Erica Bauer, who's now a PhD student at Stanford, but comes from a background of both environmental activism and has also worked in Geneva with UNHCR. So I'm going to share my screen now and hope this all works perfectly. Okay, so these are two photos of two very different environmental situations, but two cases where planned relocation is very much on the agenda. The photo on the left from Kivalina, Alaska, the one on the right from Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, a place where relocation is already taken place, or actually is in process. People have been moved off of the islands. Some have moved into their new quarters. Others are awaiting the final steps of construction. But for many of this all began in 2010. Some of you may remember that COP16 meeting in Mexico adopted a climate change adaptation framework. And while migration had very much been a part of the work of IPCC and climate change activists, everybody predicting that large numbers of people would move, this was the first time UNFCCC made a specific recommendation to all parties to look at climate change-induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation. Now, in 2010, there was already quite a bit of work going on about people moving for environmental reasons. International Organization for Migration had already commissioned a number of studies. Various academics in different parts of the world had looked at how climate change might lead to increased migration. In the field of displacement, most of the work focused around disaster-induced displacement, looking at commonalities and differences with displacement caused by conflict and violence. But at least at the international level, the term planned relocation was kind of a new term. People hadn't given much thought to this. And in fact, the normative frameworks we have for refugees, for internally displaced persons, for migrants, didn't provide much guidance on when planned relocation might take place. What were some good practices, some principles, some things we could learn? And in fact, the experience from resettlement after development projects, often spearheaded by the World Bank or regional multilateral banks, wasn't very reassuring. The consensus in that literature, development, forced displacement, and resettlement, seemed to be that most times when people were relocated, they were actually worse off. And we discovered that there are quite a few differences between planned relocations in the context of climate change and in big development projects, particularly those with international financing from the World Bank. Differences in terms of financing, differences in terms of timeline, major differences in terms of decision making. So, planned relocation, the possibility that people who have the means and see the handwriting on the wall will go ahead and move on their own. And certainly that's already taking place, as we know, around the world. That people displaced by disasters might fall in the ambit of humanitarian actors or disaster responders. But what about those who are left behind? The Foresight report in 2011 made it clear that people who are trapped or unable to move for a variety of reasons actually may be more vulnerable. Those may be the groups where assistance is needed to help them move. And so planned relocations were conceptualized as both a way of reducing the risk of disasters. Sometimes, as we'll see, they're introduced after a sudden onset disaster as a way of protecting people from recurrent flooding or landslides or other phenomena, and also as a way of adapting to climate change. So a group of international organizations and academics got together after 2010 and convened a series of expert meetings, consultations with governments, and listening to governments. Well, what do you need? What are you doing? What are you thinking? Have you ever done this before? Who would be involved, as well as a number of academics from very different disciplines. This led in 2015 to the development of guidance, which were basic principles. And it was a collaboration between a number of organizations and kind of shifting organizations over time, with UNHCR really playing a lead role in the beginning, later International Organization for Migration, a lot of consultations organized by and with the World Bank to draw on their vast experience, as well as different academic institutions. The first challenge we faced was what to call this. Cancun had referred to planned relocations. But throughout the literature and the practice, different words mean different things. Many in the World Bank sphere talked about resettlement, which for people coming from a refugee background meant something very different. Now you hear more and more the term retreat, coastal retreat, managed retreat. Some of our colleagues in the Georgetown Climate Center at the law school have done a lot of work on this in the US context. And where do evacuations fit into all of this? So different words used by different disciplines in different contexts. We had to convene an international meeting with lawyers from 9 or 10 different specialties to agree on terminology. So what we came up with was a set of guidance, general principles, and a common definition. This is all up for discussion, really throwing it out to get some reactions, that it would be a planned process versus the spontaneous movement of a community, where people would not only be physically moved to a new location, but provided with the conditions for rebuilding their lives. It wasn't enough to simply transport people to another location without providing them with the means to secure livelihoods and housing and so on. We conceptualize it as being carried out under the authority of the state. There are cases, for example, where corporations have moved whole communities, but presumably this is under the direction, or at least the normative frameworks of the state in question. And it's undertaken to protect people. We know that sometimes people are moved from the areas where they're living ostensibly for environmental reasons, but it may have a degree of land grabbing or political interest or move a particular ethnic minority. And so this is the definition we came up with for planned relocations. We analyzed every instrument and operational framework we could find, whether it was from the network involved with development-induced relocation or human rights guidance on things like evictions, and there are a number of different tools and frameworks out there, and came up with 3 different baskets of overarching principles related to legal and institutional frameworks, how you determine when such a measure is needed, how you go about planning process, and the always tricky question of when does relocation end. So these are just a couple of examples of the overarching principles. It should be used as a last resort when all other disaster risk reduction and adaptation measures have been tried. It should be carried out in a way that protects the rights of people, both those who are moved and those who are otherwise affected. Then we heard from governments, well, all these principles are really great, but what do we do? How do we even go about thinking about this, and what needs to be considered? So the next step was to develop a toolbox, again in close cooperation with a number of states who've been through this, and realizing there is no one-size-fits-all approach. The contexts in Alaska and Papua New Guinea are very, very different. And instead of coming up with normal prescriptive phrasing of government should, we decided to develop a set of checklists. Read over these, pick out the ones that are relevant for you, but maybe they'll trigger your thinking about things you haven't considered before. We organized them around 5 cross-cutting issues, each of which had a particular role to play in when the decision is made, how the plan was formulated, and how it was implemented. We heard from a number of governments that it's a very tricky time between the time a decision is made to move people and they actually settle into their new location. Other disasters can occur at that time. There can be particular needs. Sometimes services will be shut off because the community is going to be moved. And so came up with guidance on that. So these are the 5 cross-cutting issues we considered: legal framework, the needs of affected populations, the issue of participation, control, consultation, information sharing with people likely to be affected. Land issues are thorny everywhere. There are different land tenure systems in Fiji and in Louisiana, very different means of, but land is always a sensitive issue in these planned relocations. And then how to see if it works, what kind of monitoring goes on. Most of the monitoring for development-induced displacement would take place over a few years, but we know that sometimes the effects can be very long-term. So these are just some examples of the kinds of questions that we raise in our checklist. Do the laws identify who's responsible? Who has the authority to make these decisions? Have you done an environmental impact assessment of the new location, or what the impact will be on the community after people leave? questions about, how people have engaged and participated throughout the process. As I think we'll see in some of the cases, sometimes it's communities themselves that are in the driver's seat that want to move and are looking for support in order to do so. Sometimes it's coming from government who will identify a particular area at risk and suggest people need to be moved. And then ways by which land can be acquired and dealt with. Are there ways to involve the relocated population in evaluating how well it's going? So basically, we found it's a complex undertaking. Relocations in other contexts don't have a stellar record, should be used as a last resort, although sometimes that too is debatable. Maybe before all the young people move out of a community, it might be better to begin a process of relocation, given the age and the conditions of the community, and then suggest a number of areas where it's really important to take into consideration to enhance the possibility of success. So these are some of the general principles that we came up with and that have been pretty widely circulated and discussed in very different contexts. But the way these things play out varies a great deal from case to case. And so we're going to turn now to Sanjula and Erica, who've done a fairly comprehensive study of at least some of the cases and some of the lessons to be learned about planned relocations that have occurred in very different contexts. So I'll turn it over to Sanjula. And please introduce yourself, Sanjula.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you very much, Victoria and colleagues, for the opportunity to present to the network at this webinar. So I'm a lawyer by training. I'm qualified in Australia, and I've been working on forced migration issues for the better part of 15 years now. I'm currently based in Geneva, where I work, research at the intersection of international law, displacement and migration, particularly in the context of disasters and climate change and environmental degradation. So as Beth's already mentioned, I've been consulting and working with UNHCR and IOM, but my work on planned relocation really began when I was at Georgetown University, and I was involved in the series of expert meetings that Beth started talking about and the progression of the development of the guidance and the toolbox. So what Erica and I'd like to really talk to you about is this research around improving the evidence base on planned relocation. And we're really looking forward to getting your insights and suggestions on this research as well, because it's quite an undertaking. Over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes, what we'd like to do is take you through three things. The first thing is to really explain to you what it is that we're trying to do. So what is our research about? What do we actually mean when we say we're trying to improve the evidence base in the context of planned relocations that are being undertaken in the context of disasters and climate change? The second thing we'd like to do is provide some background about 6 case studies that we piloted and reviewed in depth as a way to test our methodology and our approach. And then the third thing is to explain how we plan to expand that work, that pilot work, to try and identify cases from across the world. And in doing so, also highlight some of the more difficult conceptual issues that we're coming across, as well as what we know so far on the cases in the Arctic. So first, why this research? So as you've already really heard from Beth, policy discourse on this topic has been ongoing for some time. And this is in part due to the fact that both states and or communities have been using this form of mobility, planned relocation, as a tool to move people out of harm's way in the context of hazards, disasters, and environmental degradation. And the way that Erica and I are conceptualizing planned relocation in the context of this research is in line with what the definition that Beth had highlighted, but more broadly, it's conceptualized to encompass 2 key elements. The first one is that there's a physical relocation of people from a location that presents environmental risks. And then the second dimension to it is that there's some sort of intended long-term or permanent settlement of those people in a new location, hopefully with lesser environmental risks. And states and communities are using this form of mobility, planned relocation, because it has the potential to mitigate exposure and vulnerability, and also because it creates opportunities to adapt to exposure and vulnerability. But we also know, as Beth mentioned from past practice, that relocations undermine socioeconomic prosperity and also present negative consequences for both cultural and traditional practices. So in that context, a key question for us was, how do you carry out this form of movement in a way that alleviates and ideally eliminates these negative consequences and ensures that the processes and policies that are being used are protection sensitive? But really, before we or anyone can answer that success question, we need an evidence base. And that's something we really don't have. What we have is evidence that is in many ways uneven and granular. For example, we have more knowledge about relocations in some parts of the world as compared to others. We don't have granular information about some of the processes and the policies that have been used by states. We don't know how often communities are carrying out planned relocation without any oversight or support from states or other actors. We don't know what types of participation mechanisms have been used and whether they've been gender sensitive and inclusive. Much of the available knowledge that we have has been adduced through individual cases or from within countries, small scale comparative analyses. Or, as Beth has mentioned, a lot of it has been adduced through development related projects. So in that context, what we mean by improving the evidence base and what we're actually trying to do is to understand the scale, the key characteristics, and the diversity of cases across the world. And specifically cases that have been based on and underpinned by a dominant focus on moving people out of harm's way in the context of risks related to hazards, environmental degradation, and climate change. So our global approach to looking at this issue essentially involves two key components. The first component is to identify as many unique cases of planned relocation as we can across the world, based on looking at documented material, documented literature, scholarly articles ideally, or peer-reviewed articles ideally. And then the second dimension to that is to identify specific characteristics of a subset of cases. And what I mean by characteristics is some of those questions and issues that Beth highlighted. What decision-making processes have been used? What legal frameworks have been used? What type of assessments have been undertaken? What were the participation mechanisms? The types of characteristics that were articulated in the guidance and in the toolbox as being important things to consider. And the reason why we're only kind of mapping those characteristics of a subset of cases is because we don't think we'll be able to find the breadth of information we need to identify those characteristics for all of the cases. So with that overview in mind then, let me introduce you to the pilot work we've done so far to test our methodology and our approach. We identified 6 cases from across the world to serve as a pilot. And these cases had 2 things in common. They were all initiated in the context of riverine or coastal flooding. And they all had the physical relocation component of the population completed. So the first case concerns Allenville in Arizona, where between 1978 and 81, a close-knit community of mostly African-American residents were relocated to a new site that was approximately 12 kilometres from their original homes. And the recurrence and the scale of flooding was a key reason for that relocation. The second case is from Grantham in Australia, where flash flooding in 2010 and early 2011 killed people but also destroyed many, many houses, and a decision was made to relocate the population that lived in a particularly flood-prone suburb called Grantham. The third case concerns Tegwa Island in Vanuatu, where in 1997, an Indigenous community initiated the decision to relocate within their community customary land following repeated flooding, seawater inundation, and coastal erosion. The fourth case is from India, where approximately 600 poor and marginalised households from Goromora Island in the Indian Sundarbans region were relocated to a place that was 8 kilometres away within the same jurisdiction between the late 1970s and early 1990s due to flooding, storm surges and erosion. The 5th case is from Ghana, and that concerned the Ghanaian government in 2000 relocating 3 separate Indigenous communities into 3 separate settlement sites from the coastal town of Keta. And again, it was flooding and loss of property and traditional fishing sites that prompted that relocation. And finally, in 2013, the Fijian government relocated 19 remote Indigenous households who had already been displaced by flooding into a new location and into new homes. So just that those 6 cases should already give you a flavour of the breadth and diversity of cases, and including from across regions. Some of them involve Indigenous communities, some of them involve people from a flood-prone suburb, some of them have been quite historical, some of them have taken quite a long time, and that will give you a flavour of the insights that we want to highlight to you about these case studies, which I'll hand over to Erica to talk about.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sanjula. And thanks so much again, Victoria, for inviting us to present today. We're really, really pleased to be here. I also wanted to say again how the narratives that you just described, Sanjula, are so powerful in the way that they provide color and humanity behind the characteristics in the tables that we'll be showing in just a moment. So I'm going to walk through the first 4 characteristics that we mapped. These are more descriptive in nature. So first, physical distance between the site of origin and the site of destination. Second, we wanted to know for each case how many households were involved in the relocation. Third, we wanted to understand the demographics. Were these populations Indigenous, for example? And fourth, we're interested in time. What is the duration between the initiation of the planned relocation process and the completion of that physical move for the majority, even before the often protracted resettlement process begins? So this infographic, certainly not to scale, provides you a bit of an indication of the distance of some of these cases. Interestingly, 4 of the 6 are actually within 2 kilometers. That's a relatively short distance compared to what we often may think of as planned relocation. On this slide, you can see, again, relatively short distance between locations of origin and destination. We can also point out that 3 of those cases, Danimanu, Ketagana, Tegwa Island, Vanuatu, involve Indigenous communities who have various particular relationships with land and with tradition. And third, 3 of these 6 cases involved a very protracted period even before the physical relocation took place. In Ketagana, for instance, it took 16 years between the initiation of the process and the physical move for the majority of persons. You can also see here that there is a range of the number of households. Some, like Tegwa Island, are just very small number, 8, whereas others, such as Goramora Island in India, had over 600 households. And other cases that are beyond this pilot have on the order of the hundreds of thousands, for instance, in Mozambique and in Vietnam. So with that brief introduction, I will hand it back over to you, Sanjula, to talk about some of these design relocation characteristics.
Yeah, so in addition to these descriptive characteristics, we also are trying to identify so-called design characteristics. So we tried to work out who the initiating and supporting actors were for each of these relocations. We tried to ascertain whether there were mechanisms of participation for each of the relocations. We also tried to determine if there were any types of assessments that were conducted, both at the sites of origin and at the sites of destination. So for example, whether there were environmental or risk assessments that were conducted, whether there were cost and benefit analyses that were conducted around remaining in situ, whether other options were available in terms of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation before the consideration of relocation took place. Then we looked at financial mechanisms and whether the community had to provide their own financial support, whether government actors had played a role, whether intergovernmental actors had played a role, or whether other states had chimed in providing donor funding, not donations, I don't think. And then we also looked at whether there were domestic legal and policy frameworks, and whether the relocations were underpinned by a normative architecture. And finally, we looked at challenges. There are a number of things that could possibly be said about each of these characteristics, but let me just highlight a few of them. So first, on initiating actors, and Erica, could you change? Yeah, great. First, on initiating actors, it was quite notable that in the case of Tegwa Island in Vanuatu and in the case of Allenville in the United States, the recognition of the need to relocate and the decision to initiate the relocation was undertaken by the community. Whereas in the other 4 cases, it was federal, regional, or local authorities who were integral to the decision-making process. Second, in relation to participation, we could not identify mechanisms for participation in 3 of the 6 cases. And the implication here is that in those 3 cases where there were no mechanisms for participation, it may have been much more of a top-down process. Interestingly, it was Tegwa Island and Allenville, the 2 cases that were initiated by the community that also included mechanisms for participation. And then the 3rd case was Grantham in Australia. And then the 3rd challenge, or the 3rd point that I want to make, is in relation to challenges. And in particular, a notable one relates to the fact that in 3 of those cases, there were concerns and issues around risks for secondary relocation. And this is because 6 of the cases, 6 of the settlement sites, faced additional compounding hazard exposure. So in the case of Denamanu in Fiji, there were landslides. In the case of Tegwa Island, there was flooding also at the relocation site. And then in the case of Gorolora Island, there was saline intrusion for these traditional farming communities. So there are, as I said, there are many more things I could say about some of these characteristics, but I want to mention that Erica and I have actually written a paper on these pilot cases for the NOMAD Working Group on Environmental Change. And it will hopefully be available at the end of this year, and that highlights information about these other characteristics as well, but we're also happy to field questions in the Q&A. Before I hand over to Erica to talk about how we're going to expand this pilot research to look at the globe more broadly, let me just highlight some of the preliminary insights and implications that we've drawn from these 6 cases. And we're keeping these in mind as we think about how they might be relevant for looking at the cases across the globe. So we've grouped these implications and insights into 5 broad themes at the moment. The first one relates to, I guess, the proximity of the settlement site and the origin site. And we're going to continue to map this characteristic because it has implications for governance. It has implications for the continuity of traditional livelihoods and cultural practices. It possibly has implications for hazard and environmental related risks. The second aspect is in relation to this idea of community. And there's been this preconception, and certainly in our minds, that there's some sort of pre-existing cohesiveness of communities. But these pilot case studies show that community cohesiveness is not always present. All of these relocations do not involve Indigenous communities. For example, the case in Australia was simply people who lived in a flood-prone suburb being relocated or given the option to relocate to a designated settlement site. Third, we recognise that the physical relocation itself can be quite a protracted process, lasting many years. So again, there's been a general understanding that the integration process at the settlement site can take many years because it takes a long time to re-establish networks and community structures. But what this research shows is that the physical relocation itself can be quite long-winded, and that means that dislocation process can be much more protracted than originally anticipated. Fourth, This pilot research has also shown that communities may initiate the planned relocation process, that non-governmental actors may be enablers, and that governments may have very little involvement or oversight in some of these cases. And we'll pay close attention to this as well, because maybe there are all these cases where none of us need to get involved at all. They're happening and they're fine, and everyone's maybe there are better successful outcomes, and it's worth recognizing that if that is the case. And fifth, around legal frameworks, it was clear that a number of these relocations are being undertaken without domestic normative architecture. And again, this has implications for protection and rights-sensitive and dignity-sensitive processes, but also accountability. Where governments are involved and they're being undertaken without a normative architecture, who's accountable when things don't go right? So those are just some preliminary insights. We've found all of these themes quite useful already from the 6 case studies, and they're issues we're keeping in mind as we look at expanding to the global research, which I'll let Erica talk about.
Thanks, Sanjula. So again, returning to this initial slide which you shared, I just wanted to emphasize again the 2-pronged approach that we're taking to this global mapping. First, we're looking to identify cases, as many as we can, of disaster-related planned relocations across the globe. And second, we're looking to map characteristics of a subset of those cases. So our next steps, and this is work that's ongoing, is first, case identification. We've come across between 250 to 300 cases to date from academic literature, gray literature, and from those cases, we're looking to select a subset that have sufficient information to code the 10 characteristics you just heard about. Our approach to coding involves triangulation between us as 2 separate researchers. And an important limitation to note here is that this current approach is really focused on the presence or the absence of a given feature, whether or not there's a law, whether or not there's an assessment. We don't have the capacity to analyze actually the quality of those characteristics, and that's something that future research should absolutely focus on. So this 2-pronged approach, the global mapping and then the mapping of characteristics, will be a part of a report that's will be finalized the end of 2020 or early 2021 by the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the Caldor Center. In follow-up to this initial mapping the baseline report, we're interested in focusing on specific regions, specific hazards, and specific thematic dynamics that are really emerging already as important areas to be, that have specific dynamics around planned relocation. For example, in the Arctic, there are unique features that we would love to talk more about during the question and answer session. So in thinking about this process, it's worth noting that there are some cases, as Beth mentioned earlier, that may fit into these definitions in some contexts and less in others. So it's worth walking through what we are conceptualizing as a planned relocation case. And in doing so, we'll highlight 5 criteria that have emerged in this analysis so far as particularly critical. First, we're including cases that are associated with natural hazards or climate change impacts. We're not including cases that are initiated in relation to dams, development projects, or technological hazards. Second, we're really focused on the movement of human beings. We're looking at the movement of, and we're not looking at movement of dikes or buildings. For example, we're also not looking at movement of animal species for conservation purposes. Third, we're looking at cases where there is evidence to suggest there was a planned process involving leadership, coordination, or support. A caveat is to note that that planned process can happen with the help of an external actor, for instance, a government or an NGO or a corporation, but that planned process can also emerge from within. It could be a chief or a local community leader. And again, we're not looking at cases where there's no evidence of planning. We're looking at cases, criteria 4, where there is a defined location of origin and a defined location of destination. We're not looking at cases that don't have defined locations. And finally, this notion of what constitutes a community or what constitutes a group of relocating persons is a very complex one. But to the extent that we can, we're looking at groups of persons, not individual households, such as through buyouts. So in talking about what constitutes this conceptualization of a planned relocation case, we've come across a number of thorny issues, many of which Beth has already mentioned, that also emerged in the process of developing the guidance in the toolbox. I'll highlight two of those today. So first, we've realized that there are many distinct patterns of planned relocation. Many of us have in our minds this perhaps romanticized idea of a planned relocation that involves one distinct, discrete community in a location A moving to another discrete location B as a constituent whole. And this indeed does happen in a lot of cases. However, there are also cases, for instance, the example Ketagana, which Sanjula has mentioned earlier, where a number of communities in multiple locations of origin are moved in conjunction to multiple destinations. This is what we're calling type B. There are also cases where multiple groups of households in multiple origin sites are collectively moved to one destination, type C. Conversely, there are cases where one group of households in a place of origin is moved to many destination sites. And finally, there is type E, which involves many groups of people in many origin sites that are enabled to move to many destination sites, but there are no efforts to ensure community cohesion or continuity that the communities and the households in the location to begin with and to end with are matching. We often talk about managed retreat, and this is one of the terms that Beth has mentioned earlier. A key strategy for managed retreat is buyouts. This is an example of what we would perhaps classify in this type E category. And it's important to realize that the questions you would ask, the governance features that are important, vary significantly depending on which of these strategies a government or an enabling actor is utilizing. In this project, we're mapping primarily cases that meet this pattern A, but we're interested in understanding these dynamics of other cases for onward work. A second thorny issue, and again, this has already been touched on to some extent. Who is being relocated? These are cases perhaps at the margins of how we conventionally conceptualize what constitutes a planned relocation. So, as has already been mentioned, Indigenous communities have histories and legacies of past marginalization and may have been relocated on previous occasions. This has unique dynamics for protection. Second, nomadic communities, pastoralists, boat people, for instance, caribou herders in parts of Siberia have unique dynamics or unique relationships with mobility. They're non-sedentary to begin with. So then when a government initiates a process to plan a disaster-related relocation and make these non-sedentary populations sedentary, it has a specific set of meanings and unique requirements. Just to highlight two other categories that are unique cases. In many parts of the world, planned relocations related to disasters are often used to justify eviction or, in some circumstances, population consolidation of informal settlers or urban poor. And these are circumstances, again, with unique considerations for designing a planned relocation process, and in fact, raise a lot of thorny issues about whether or not this is even appropriate. And finally, non-citizen communities, such as refugees and internally displaced persons, in some circumstances require onward relocation because of a hazard or another types of climate-related impact. And this is another interesting case, just to flag. So in this slide, you can see a number of cases that we've already identified in the Arctic region. So this is what we know. You can see here 12 villages that are already exploring relocation options in the context of Alaska. Shishmaref, Nutok, Kivalina, these are some of the ones that have certainly made more media headlines. But in addition to these 12 cases, we've identified 13 others, communities that have either historically or are currently relocating in the context of climate change and disasters, for a total of 25 in Alaska alone. But we're really interested to hear from those who are on this call. There's a tremendous amount of expertise and wealth of knowledge. And we'd really love to hear from you if there are any other cases outside of Alaska that you have worked with, that you're aware of, and that you think should be a part of this mapping. So again, just wanted to say thank you again for the opportunity to present this research and to engage with you all today. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. We'd love to hear if you have any cases that you're aware of that you think should be a part of this mapping. We'd also love to know what dynamics of planned relocation you think are unique to the Arctic region. And finally, we really want this to be useful for you. So we're wondering if from your perspective, there are any other specific opportunities or ways that you think this mapping could be useful to you in your work. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Victoria. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Erica, Beth, Sanjula, for an incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. We are going to move into the question and answer session of our webinar now, but I want to give some space for anyone who wants to immediately respond to what Erica just proposed. If you have an experienced professional or personal that could answer any of Erica's open-ended questions about relocation, displacement, migration in the Arctic, I would welcome you to, again, raise your hand in the participant or put it in the chat now. So I will be monitoring that, and hopefully we will get some responses, Erica, to your question. As we are waiting for those responses to come in, I am going to ask Rachel to unmute herself and perhaps come on video to share her question and some thoughts.
Hi, I've been having, thank you so much for these amazing presentations. I'm in Arizona right now, and I have two questions. One is kind of a follow-up with Erica, your presentation, not having worked in the Arctic, but been involved with homeless communities for a very long time and have actually experienced homelessness myself. And I'm involved with a group called the Poor People's Campaign, and they're helping do a lot of good work around homeless encampments in the US and some of the really draconian policies that are happening at the city level with just relocating massive groups of people or really effectively booting them out. They haven't come up with any solutions because they haven't been able to solve homelessness itself, which is deeply rooted in inequities at all levels of the social and economic spheres. But my comment and question around that is how, in some of your work or in anyone else's work, how have you seen successfully in the US homeless communities actually being dignifyingly and protectively helped to move from one place to another in the specific context of encampments? I've lived and worked in hot spots for homeless, rise in homeless populations in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, and in Denver, Colorado. So I'm just wondering how to approach that in a country that's very much still in denial. They want to sweep everybody literally away from view. And then my other question, which is tied in a little bit in the context of relocating any group relating to climate and natural disasters, climate refugees, how are there specific tools to help protect any personal data, especially if they're moving from island to island or country to country, that we're using, especially if any of the children are under protected status? I'm just thinking broadly about the loss of and shuffle of just papers when you're going through a massive relocation, but the digital sphere brings its own challenges. So thank you for my listening to my elongated question. Did that Could you hear anything during that whole time?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
Erica,
I'm having
Sanjula.
I'm having sound issues now, so
I don't
I think
know.
it was a brilliant question. I want to see if Beth has an answer.
No, I mean, I haven't seen it applied to,
really long.
I haven't seen it applied to homeless populations except in the literature on eviction. There's kind of a correlation there. I mean, part of it is this conceptualization of planned relocation as a way of protecting people. There are tons of cases of urban gentrification where poor people are moved out of city centers, whether it's Zimbabwe or Somalia or other places. That wouldn't fall under a planned relocation to protect people as we've conceptualized it. But go ahead, Erica.
I was going to say that I don't think we've come across anything so far that's specific to homeless populations, but it seems like interventions that are needed and unclear what best practice looks like. I think that the guidance and the toolbox that Beth has already described in great detail may offer some useful questions, but they're certainly not tailored specifically to homeless populations. It's an interesting area, though.
I think also, Rachel, what you raise is also coming up to some extent in the context of disasters and climate change, because there are a lot of people who are moving into cities, into slum areas that are highly exposed to disasters, and often these are populations who are highly marginalised. So in some contexts, these marginalised urban poor populations who may not necessarily be homeless per se, but are extremely poor and living in very difficult circumstances, are moving into exposed areas. And in some contexts, governments are using perhaps relocation as a pretext to also clear out some of these slum areas. So this is another one of the thorny issues that Erica and I are also finding in the research that we're doing, because we've defined the research as one in which people need to be moved predominantly in the context of protection from disaster and hazard-related risks. But you can see these political interests also overlaying some of the decision-making process as well. So that's not answering your question. I'm adding more complexity to it, but we are seeing marginalised populations in slum areas also being moved away and relocated.
Thank you for those answers, and to remind us of how complex and thorny this issue is and how intersectional it is. I'm going to ask Rebecca to unmute herself and ask her question next.
Hi, thank you. So far it's been really, really interesting. So I'm actually working on my undergrad thesis right now, and I'm looking at planned relocation in Papua New Guinea versus one in Fiji, and then seeing if a weak government structure influences how successful it was in the end. So this has helped me a lot. Thank you. But I mentioned in the comments, and I have a brief question. So you talked about indigenous land rights in the Pacific briefly, and I think a bit in the Arctic too. So I was wondering if, when there's this issue of customary land alternatives, and people in that community aren't able to relocate to customary land, does it cause the community, what are the different what are the different approaches that these people can take, especially when there's limited resources? I know from looking at small island developing states in the Pacific that I see a lot of communities which have government access or like limited government helping them, but then they end up having all these small resources and having very little customary land. And then also, if they do stay on customary land, have you found a trend that it tends to be more hazardous and that there will be further relocation? Yeah, thank you.
Great. Does someone want to take the first answer of that, I think, really meaningful question?
I'm happy to shed some initial insights, but would welcome comments from Sanjula and Beth after. I think in the context of Fiji and a number of other small island developing states, there are a lot of relocations where, as you're saying, it is within customary land tenure. More often than not, it seems like that's the option that a lot of these communities are taking. They're a relatively short distance, and there are many reasons for that. It's just more convenient, it's within their immediate surroundings, it's closer to their livelihoods, which are predominantly tied to oceans. But in the examples where there has been cross-jurisdictional relocations to non-customary land, it seems like there's a lot more conflict with host communities. And again, there's many layers of complexity there. I don't know if that quite answers your question, other than just to say that this is a meaningful distinction. And I think it lends itself to more communities prioritizing that short distance move to the extent that they can.
And maybe if I could ask Rebecca, you said that you were working on Papua New Guinea. You know, what have you found there? I mean, there have been some big issues with traditional customary land tenure and problems with relocations. I don't know, have you found examples of things that work or have been tried?
So I'm mostly looking at the case study of the, God forbid my English, the Carteret Islands, and then in Ujongo, I believe.
Right.
So I'm looking at the weak state structure there, since they just went through a civil war and have their own autonomous government. And I'm looking how NGOs actually played a role in that, and then seeing if this less government-oriented push and actually was worse than the one in Fiji. From what I've seen, I've done some research on IDPs that are displaced from natural disasters in the mainland, but I haven't seen too. Sorry, could you just repeat that last bit again?
No, I was just curious what you'd found in terms of provision of land safe from people from the Carterets. I know that's been going on for a long time. I mean, they're
chatting, and then I just no. So they were actually relocated to the mainland in that instance. And from what I can tell, there's not a lot of literature on it, and not especially in the Pacific. But from what I can tell is that they ended up going from small indigenous community, well, a small, not terribly small, but an indigenous community where they mostly lived off of farming and then fishing. And then they were located to a larger city population. So a lot of them didn't have the infrastructure in the first place when they moved over. They were given the resources to actually move, but weren't given long-term economic opportunities. So that's the challenges that I'm finding so far, but I'm really in the preliminary stages of research, so I don't know. I need to contact some other people who've worked on the case studies and see how they fare, because that was back in 2006, I believe.
Yeah. Just say, I think it's a really complicated case. I think they moved and then they moved back, and Catholic Church provided some land, and then that didn't work out. I don't know what's happened the last couple of years.
I guess another dimension that comes up when you talk about this, Rebecca, in my mind is how the aspect of who initiated the planned relocation is relevant for your question. So as we said in the Tegwa Island case, for example, they moved within customary land, but it was also the community that initiated that planned relocation. So it might be interesting to try and look at how the initiating actor correlates with whether or not you are moving within customary land. And then I also just wanted to highlight the Grantham case, where this wasn't an Indigenous community at all. It was the Australian government, and particularly the state and local authorities who were involved. And they designated a piece of land that was meant to be for development as a settlement site. So this wasn't an Indigenous community. It had nothing to do with customary land, but they managed to find local land to allow people to relocate from a flood-prone area. So I guess there's a range of complexities, but that's what we found out from the 6 cases we've really looked at in depth.
Thank you. And I hope that at least creates some seeds for further research, Rebecca, and maybe some follow-ups with our presenters today. We have another question from Barrett Ristroff, who works with Alaska Native villages who are getting fatigued from research on relocation and other issues that may not directly benefit them. Is there a way that researchers can partner with willing communities to provide technical support on relocation? So things beyond research and reports.
Yeah, I think that's terribly important. There have been a few cases on relocations in the U.S., particularly this Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, where there have been a whole bunch of researchers and media coverage in ways that haven't been helpful to the community or to the process. But partnering with local organizations to assess what has happened, and particularly this evaluation and monitoring, how things have worked out in practice, including the community, is really essential. I don't know if there's any way to, have some kind of a code of conduct or something where researchers don't just start asking all kinds of questions to communities when they're unable to realize any benefit from participating in the research.
And I guess also just want to add that I know this wasn't a critique of our research as much, but our research is, and this is to some extent why we decided to do this research as well, because there are a lot of individual case studies and those are intensive in terms of the extent to which they engage with the communities that have been affected. Whereas what we're trying to do is gather as much as possible the material that's available already from the literature without having to intervene in anyone's life and investigate the process directly. That said, I guess this research is then also meant to subsequently inform efforts to understand what might be a successful planned relocation or how you can alleviate some of those negative socioeconomic outcomes. And by having a cross-section of information, a baseline of information about the characteristics of these relocation cases means that people could dig into some of the evidence that's already available on paper, rather than trying to go out to each individual community to find out more information. Yeah, I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's just a clarification on what we're trying to do and the purpose behind it as well.
Erica, did you want to add anything to that follow-up, or did those answers suffice?
All good.
So we have another question from Jasper Hardetsky, who is curious of how relocation driven by climate-driven conflict, so increased water scarcity with cultural, resource, ethnic issues exacerbated by climate stress, might also be better understood or considered based on your study findings and future research. So can you tell us a bit more about that potential application or connection to climate-driven conflict?
Yeah, I think that's really a question for Sanjula, who completed a study last year on the relationship between climate and conflict in specific cases, not focusing so much on planned relocation, but how climate and conflict intersect to produce displacement.
Thanks, Beth. Look, I think that this is a really complex area, and the empirical evidence is really not clear, and I land in the position where the empirical evidence on climate driving conflict is really not clear, and certainly not at the global level. So when you're looking at the intersection between changes in the climate and climate variability and hazards potentially creating tensions, it's really important, I think, to look at it from the perspective of local level dynamics, because the contextual factors play a really big role in whether or not a given environmental situation and changes in the climate may then prompt tensions and unrest. So I think there are clearer evidence on some of these dynamics in parts of the Sahel, for example, but we definitely can't expand that to make global level conclusions about it. And I think there are a lot of disagreement in this area and there's a lot of discourse in it. But from my perspective, I think that it's important to look at it from particular geographic locations and hotspots and to understand the governance and the environmental dynamics and see how they may have led to tensions and unrest, as well as looking at the kind of ethnic compositions as well and the resource availability. That said, I can't tell you any examples that I've come across where populations have been relocated because of the conflict that's been created after being moved in the context of climate change. I don't know any examples where that has happened, but that is certainly something we're also trying to stay abreast of. So Erica already mentioned that she's found roughly 250 to 300 cases. And in that context, we are trying to work out some of the different dynamics and the different locations in which these relocations are taking place. So if we do come across anything, we'd be happy to reach out. But at the moment, I don't know any. I don't know, Erica, if you have come across anything.
I was going to say, harkening back to what Beth mentioned at the beginning with the Cancun Adaptation Framework, paragraph 14F, thinking about the distinctions between planned relocation as a distinct form of human mobility in relation to voluntary migration and then forced displacement, I think a lot of the cases that we've seen of this category of planned relocation have not necessarily had overlap with conflict. Many more cases in that forced displacement category do, as Sanjula mentioned. That said, we've seen instances where populations that have relocated have experienced conflict with their host communities after they have already relocated. So for instance, the Goramora, India case, there's some evidence to suggest that the community faced conflict with a different ethnic group in the destination over a limited number of wells. So they had a limited number of points for access to water, and ethnic tensions were exacerbated by that. So it's more of a retroactive, it didn't drive the relocation, but it is part of the story. And I think conflict can exist at so many different scales and units of analysis. And rather than thinking about conflict exclusively in the macro scale, thinking about it in a very localized way, as Sanjula mentioned, is a helpful frame here.
Great. Thank you for that response and some homework to follow up with, additional reading. We have another question from the Coordination Sahel and Migration group. And they want to know if you would add a kind of evaluation of these planned relocations to your database. So feedback from people being relocated. And perhaps you can, maybe this is me adding another question, but talk about if in your research you have seen that there are effective post-relocation evaluations that governments or other groups are conducting. And if those exist, are there things that we can learn from those evaluations?
I'd start by pointing out that this idea of a comprehensive evaluation of a relocation outcome is a really, really complex one. What does success even mean in this context? There are environmental dimensions, there are human social dimensions, there are psychological dimensions, there are physical, built infrastructural dimensions. Success has so many different meanings to so many different actors. And then, as you're saying, there's this distinction between who are we asking about success? Is it the people who've relocated themselves, or is it the government enabling actor? It also depends when we're asking about success. Is it the year after the physical move? Is it a decade later? Is it 6 decades later? So I guess the short answer is this is a really important question. It is not one that we're going to be able to encompass in these 10 characteristics that we're mapping for this project, but it's an incredibly important area for future inquiry. And on your question, Victoria, about what is really a best practice model for what an evaluation could look like, I'm really curious if Beth or Sanjula has come across a good example, because I I think I've seen some less adequate examples, but not one I'd highlight.
I haven't seen any good examples, frankly, of evaluations of relocation programs in the context of climate change or environmental disasters. But you know, there's a huge literature of evaluations conducted by the World Bank on how well resettlement processes happened after dams and construction and so forth. You know, and this illustrates one of the differences is that, you know, when the World Bank financed, say, a dam project, some of the proceeds, some of the savings, some of the profits, if you will, of that dam go into such things as commissioning a full-scale evaluation. Some of the evaluations are very long, running hundreds of pages, including some reference at least to relocated populations, but a lot of other technical level evaluations as well. But when there are relocations in the context of environment or climate change, governments sometimes just don't have the money or don't see it as a priority to do the evaluation. You know, it's tough enough to manage a relocation of people, say, from a flood-prone area, and whether they do an internal evaluation or it's something that's quick, or if it does involve you know, commissioning input from the individuals who have been relocated, those usually aren't made public. One that has been, one of the few cases I've seen where there was an extensive survey of participants in relocation was Vietnam, where, you know, a very large program of relocating hundreds of thousands of people from areas where they will be safer, found that one of the conclusions was people felt much safer. They felt relieved that they didn't have to deal with the threat of flooding all the time, but they also had incurred a lot of debt in actually making the move, and therefore felt more burdened with the economic debt of you know, kind of paying for the move and all of the associated expenses in ways that, you know, I don't think the authorities anticipated. But, you know, certainly the need for evaluations is something that's constant throughout that, but often isn't prioritized by governments making these decisions.
I can just add, this wasn't a formal evaluation, but in the Tegwa Island case, the Canadian government had been involved in providing some donor funding for that relocation. And in that context, there was some researchers, including local researchers, who were involved in carrying out informant interviews with the people who moved to try and understand how they felt about the relocation, what they appreciated. And so, not a formal evaluation, but it was a key informant interview to understand how the beneficiaries of that relocation felt about it. And in that context, it was represented as a success, in that people were happy that the move had taken place. It had reduced the level of illnesses, it had reduced flooding, it had improved their hygiene practices. So there were a whole host of things that they were happy about in the context of that relocation. But I imagine that in the context of doing this expanded research beyond our 6 case studies, that maybe we'll come across a bit more information. But the other thing I wanted to add is, in some ways, this is exactly why we're doing this research, because by being able to map 10 characteristics, if we can map them for each of these cases, what that does is allow researchers to then hone in on a particular theme if they're interested, or multiple themes if they're interested, and to fashion their methodology in such a way where they could conceptualize success according to 3 of those dynamics, say participatory mechanisms, non-secondary relocation, and a useful normative framework, and look at those aspects in cases and identify how they've worked. For example, Erica and I have talked about how we're coming across very few cases that have actually had environmental risk assessments at sites of origin and sites of destination. We could certainly dig further and see if that is actually the case. But if there are no assessments being conducted, what cost-benefit analysis is being undertaken to relocate these people? And how do you know that that relocation site's not going to present the same risks down the road? So it's essentially meant to provide that evidence base for people to be able to ask these questions in a much more thoughtful way and to be able to answer them.
I think that is a great output of research, right? Providing a platform upon which more research can be built and inviting more people to the table to do that research. So I am very much looking forward to reading your research once it is out publicly. But Sanjula, you bring up a point of there not being that many environmental impact assessments. And as I think about this network being multidisciplinary, right? We have macroecologists, we have biologists, we have glaciologists, we have social scientists, we have humanities scholars, we have traditional knowledge holders. And I wonder if each of you can talk about maybe the ways in which you have worked across different disciplines, including natural science, social science, humanities, maybe some of the barriers you faced, and maybe an invitation of who we can invite to this table that maybe doesn't yet have as big a voice in thinking about planned relocation research and ultimately support for planned relocations in, Erica, whatever success we can define with communities and community leaders.
Maybe I'll kick things off. I think, I do a lot of work on climate migration generally, not just planned relocations. And working across disciplines is sometimes the biggest challenge, particularly with climate scientists and migration researchers who start with different understandings of how and when and why migration occurs. You know, sometimes I think that just the terminology, the jargon, where articles are published, it's hard sometimes to understand some of the complex models that climate scientists are using. But, you know, I think we need more opportunities for that exchange. And maybe we need to break out not only of our disciplinary silos, but even our cherished jargon, you know, where we love to talk in terms that are familiar to us and not realize that sometimes it's really alienating. From a migration research perspective, sometimes it seems like natural science oversimplify the way in which individuals decide to move and the myriad of factors that affect those decisions, household characteristics, but situations, geography. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into those decisions. It isn't just a direct relationship between, say, sea level rise and automatically people are going to move. It just doesn't work that way. But finding ways to really connect and really draw from the strengths of our different disciplines is a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, that's a really hard question for me, Victoria, because the main area that I see, well, absolutely, cross-disciplinary actors are relevant for all of these areas. But when I think about natural scientists, the key area, and environmentalists, the key area that I see as being relevant is that assessment area, because the other characteristics we're mapping are norms, which basically require lawyers. Participatory mechanisms are also maybe not the arena of natural scientists and others. Then there's funding, which is a completely different area of work. So the assessment aspect is really where I see that interface being particularly relevant. And then it depends on how you interface with the community level actors who are also making these decisions. So when you look at the Tegwa case, for example, it was the community and the village chief together with the households who made that decision to move, but then they required funding from external actors to support that move. So we could not work out at all to what extent external actors had played a role in the assessment of the origin site or the relocation site, really. And it was in that case also where there were continuing hazard-related risks and a possible risk of relocation. So I do see that being one of the key areas where scientists will play a key role, but I don't know how they interface with Indigenous actors.
Just to break that notion of assessment down a little bit further, we're thinking about this in two ways. First, is a relocation even necessary? And then second, is this site appropriate for the relocation destination? And I think at both of those periods of time, we've seen in existing cases examples of where Indigenous knowledge has actually been more relevant than a scientific assessment, or has in fact been the only piece of evidence that's been used to make that decision. And also examples where a very technical engineering assessment was what was required to make that distinction. So I think there's a real opportunity at both of those temporal entry points for collaboration of interdisciplinary scientists to be working in these spaces, and that Indigenous knowledge in particular has a really important role to play, as well as other forms of knowledge. I also think this question of silos and breaking them down is like, it's my lived experience every day. I'm working as an interdisciplinary PhD student at the interface of migration studies and climate adaptation science, and getting those two faculty and two discourses to go in conversation, which I think is fundamentally necessary to make progress on this issue. As Beth has mentioned, there are so many lessons to be learned from that cross-pollination. So I think networks like this one are really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Erica, I think you bring up an important point that we create these silos, but they aren't that deep, right? Because there are many identities that all of us take on. An individual can be a resident, can be an indigenous knowledge holder, and can be an atmospheric scientist, and can play multiple roles at the table of decision making, of assessing, and ultimately of collaborating. So I think that, you know, opening the door to multidisciplinary discussions and hopefully continued engagement and relationships that we'll build in this network are one small step to starting to break those down and hopefully bring people together. As we are finishing up, I'm going to ask our three panelists to just think of any parting words that they might have for you. And before I hand it over to them for those final words, I just want to remind everyone that this is part of a webinar series, and we have our next webinar on Wednesday, October 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will be hearing from Dr. Marcy Rockman on cultural heritage, climate change, and policy making, and how we can use cultural heritage policy to affect change in climate adaptation and mitigation in the Arctic. So I hope to see you there, and we will be sharing the link to register for that and the recording of this webinar tomorrow in an email. But for now, I want to hand it over for any parting words from our three incredible presenters, which please join me in giving a virtual round of applause for an incredibly thoughtful and really a spark to think about these issues further, and hopefully to follow up with more conversation and collaboration on planned relocation, but also this idea of mobility, of climate change, of you know, working across different disciplines to think about assessment, research, and ultimately action in a climate changed Arctic and a climate changed world. Beth, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think we really appreciate all the questions and comments. And I will note that the topic of the next seminar, cultural heritage, is also a component of planned relocations, how to deal with those issues. So thanks, Victoria, and everybody.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and everyone else on the webinar for listening to us. We're so grateful for the opportunity to present our work. And as Erica said at the end of our presentation, we'd love to get your insights and thoughts on the work that we're doing. So our emails are there on that presentation slide. If you have any further comments for us, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
And just to echo again, one more time, thank you so much, Victoria, and so much, Beth, and so much to everyone on the call for these excellent questions and really interesting conversation. More than happy to continue the conversation. You have our email addresses. We're really looking forward to working with you all and towards creating, improving the knowledge base on planned relocations in the context of a changing world and climate. Thanks.
Erica, Sanjula, Beth, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your experience, and your time with us today. For everyone else on the call, thank you for joining us too. We will be sharing our presenters' emails in our email tomorrow, so please follow up with them if you have experiences, resources, or questions. But until our next webinar on October 7th, I hope everyone has a wonderful few weeks of fall wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us, and can't wait to see you next time.